January 17th, 1944, a frozen motor pool somewhere in the Ardennes forest, eastern Belgium. The air smells of engine oil and cold steel. Frost clings to the canvas hoods of parked vehicles like a second skin. In the dim light before dawn, a young private named Eugene Hartley kneels beside a Willys MB Jeep, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. His hands, blackened with grease, work methodically inside the engine bay. Around him, other mechanics shake their heads. They've seen field modifications before, desperate improvisations that fail more often than they succeed. But what Hartley is attempting seems impossible. He's rebuilding the Jeep's four-cylinder engine using salvaged parts from a wrecked reconnaissance plane, hand-filed components and a carburetor he fashioned from a fuel pump casing and copper tubing scavenged from a bombed-out farmhouse. To the men watching, it looks like the work of a dreamer. To Hartley, it's the only way forward. The Jeep was never designed to be a powerhouse. When the US Army issued specifications for a light reconnaissance vehicle in 1940, they wanted simplicity, durability, and mass production capability. The result was the Willys MB, a quarter-ton vehicle powered by a modest Go Devil engine producing just 60 horsepower. It could climb steep grades, ford shallow rivers, and carry troops across terrain where heavier vehicles would sink or stall. But power was not its strength. Speed was not its purpose. The Jeep was a workhorse, not a warhorse. And yet in the chaos of mechanized warfare across Europe's shattered landscapes, soldiers quickly discovered that survival often depended on speed, acceleration, and the ability to outrun German armour when retreat became the only option. Standard procedure couldn't account for every battlefield reality. The manual said the Jeep was sufficient. Experience said otherwise. Eugene Hartley had grown up in rural Michigan, where his father ran a small garage fixing tractors and farm equipment during the Depression. By the age of 12, Hartley could disassemble a carburetor blindfolded. By 15, he was modifying engines to squeeze extra torque from worn-out machinery that farmers couldn't afford to replace. When he enlisted in 1942, the Army placed him in a motor transport unit, where his skills were supposed to keep vehicles running under impossible conditions. But Hartley wasn't interested in merely maintaining machines. He wanted to improve them. He studied the Jeep's weaknesses obsessively: the sluggish acceleration, the wheezing climb up muddy inclines, the way the engine strained under loads it was never meant to carry. He took notes in a grease-stained notebook, sketching modifications that other mechanics dismissed as fantasy. They called him a tinkerer. They called his ideas dangerous. And when he finally announced that he intended to rebuild a Jeep engine to produce more than 3 times its original horsepower, they called him insane. But war has a way of turning eccentricity into necessity. By the winter of 1944, the Allied advance through France and Belgium had slowed to a grinding crawl. German forces, though retreating, fought with brutal efficiency, turning every village and crossroad into a contested killing ground. American supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles. Mechanized units needed vehicles that could move fast, carry heavy loads, and escape ambushes without becoming coffins on wheels. The standard Jeep, for all its legendary reliability, struggled in these conditions. Hartley had watched too many convoys get caught by German tanks because their Jeeps couldn't accelerate quickly enough. He'd seen vehicles bogged down in mud, their engines screaming uselessly as enemy fire closed in. And he'd made a promise to himself. If he survived the war, it wouldn't be because he followed the manual. It would be because he rewrote it. The modifications began in secrecy. Hartley salvaged a supercharger assembly from a downed P-47 Thunderbolt fighter plane, a massive aircraft engine component that nobody believed could be adapted to a vehicle 1/100th the size. He hand-machined adapter plates in a makeshift workshop, using files and drill bits he traded for cigarettes and chocolate. He recalibrated the fuel delivery system, increasing flow rates beyond factory specifications. He reinforced the crankshaft with steel he stripped from a destroyed German half-track, welding and grinding until the metal fit perfectly. Every modification violated Army regulations. Every adjustment risked catastrophic engine failure. But Hartley worked with the precision of a surgeon and the stubbornness of a man who refused to accept limitations designed by people who had never been shot at. The other mechanics watched with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. Sergeant Bill Kowalski, a career army man from Pittsburgh, stood over Hartley's shoulder one afternoon and asked the question everyone was thinking: Even if this works, Hartley, what's the point? You're going to get court-martialed for destroying government property. Hartley didn't look up from his work. Won't matter if I'm dead because the engine couldn't outrun a panzer. Kowalski had no answer for that. It took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of stolen hours after official duties ended, of working by flashlight under tarps to hide the glow from German reconnaissance planes, of testing components that sometimes exploded and had to be rebuilt from scratch. Hartley installed a custom exhaust manifold that routed heat away from the supercharger. He modified the ignition timing to prevent detonation under boost pressure. He fabricated a makeshift intercooler using copper coils and a water reservoir mounted beneath the passenger seat. The work was painstaking, invisible, and utterly obsessive. And when he finally bolted the hood back onto the Jeep and turned the ignition key for the first time, the engine roared to life with a sound no one in the motor pool had ever heard before. It wasn't the familiar puttering of the Go Devil engine. It was a deep, aggressive snarl, a mechanical growl that vibrated through the ground and turned heads across the entire camp. Hartley blipped the throttle. The engine responded instantly, revving with a ferocity that seemed impossible from a vehicle that size. Men dropped tools and walked over, disbelief written across their faces. Sergeant Kowalski stared at the shaking Jeep, then at Hartley. "What the hell did you do?" Hartley allowed himself a thin smile. "Made it faster." But speed alone wasn't enough. The true test came 3 days later when a German counter-offensive broke through Allied lines near Bastogne. Hartley's unit received orders to evacuate a forward observation post before enemy armour arrived. The roads were icy, visibility was near zero, and intelligence reports estimated they had less than 30 minutes before German tanks overran the position. Standard Jeeps could make the run in 45 minutes under perfect conditions. Hartley volunteered his modified vehicle. He drove with a lieutenant named Graves and a radio man named Corporal Hayes. The Jeep launched forward with violent acceleration that pinned them against their seats. Hartley shifted gears, and the supercharger screamed as boost pressure climbed. They hit 60 miles per hour on a dirt road designed for half that speed. The engine howled, the suspension rattled, and the steering wheel vibrated so hard Hartley's hands went numb. But they flew. They tore through frozen mud that would have bogged down any other vehicle. They powered up hills that should have been impossible. And when they reached the observation post, extracted the stranded soldiers, and raced back toward friendly lines, they did so with German shells exploding in their wake. Shells that landed exactly where they would have been if they'd been driving a standard Jeep. The modified Jeep made the round trip in 22 minutes. When they pulled back into camp, smoke rising from the engine bay and the smell of burning oil thick in the air, nobody laughed anymore. Nobody called Hartley a tinkerer. Graves, the lieutenant, climbed out on shaking legs and stared at the Jeep like it was a supernatural creature. "How much horsepower?" he asked. Hartley popped the hood, revealing the glowing supercharger and custom intake. "About 200, give or take." Word spread fast. Within a week, officers from other units came to inspect the impossible Jeep. Some wanted Hartley to replicate the modifications for their vehicles. Others warned that unsanctioned alterations could result in disciplinary action. But the results spoke louder than regulations. Hartley's Jeep had accomplished what no standard vehicle could. It had turned a utilitarian transport into a life-saving weapon. And in doing so, it revealed a deeper truth about American ingenuity in wartime. That innovation didn't always come from factories or laboratories. Sometimes it came from a greasy private working by flashlight, with salvaged parts and a refusal to accept the limits others imposed. The symbolic power of that engine extended beyond mechanics. To the German soldiers who later captured intelligence reports describing modified American vehicles, it represented something they had been taught to dismiss: the creativity of democratic individualism. Nazi ideology emphasized obedience, uniformity, and the supremacy of central planning. The idea that a lone soldier could independently redesign military equipment in a field workshop was incomprehensible within their doctrinal framework. German engineering was legendary for its precision and complexity: Tiger tanks, Messerschmitt fighters, V-2 rockets. But these marvels required massive industrial infrastructure, strict hierarchies, and thousands of specialized workers. The German war machine was brilliant but brittle. It couldn't adapt quickly. It couldn't improvise solutions at the individual level. And when confronted with enemies who could, it struggled to respond. The Jeep engine became a symbol of that asymmetry. Here was a vehicle that shouldn't have been formidable, modified by a soldier who shouldn't have had the authority, producing results that shouldn't have been possible. It embodied the unpredictability of a system that empowered individuals to think, experiment, and take risks. The Germans had mocked American industrial output as quantity over quality, crude assembly lines producing mediocre machines. They assumed superiority in engineering sophistication, but they failed to account for the millions of Eugene Hartleys scattered across the American war effort, mechanics, technicians, and thinkers who refused to treat manuals as gospel and who saw every limitation as a challenge to overcome. By the spring of 1945, Hartley's modifications had been documented by Army engineers and incorporated in modified, safer forms into field maintenance protocols. The original Jeep, battered and scarred, remained in service until the war's end. It survived the Battle of the Bulge, the Rhine crossing, and the final push into Germany. And when victory finally came, Hartley returned to Michigan, where he opened a small garage not unlike his father's. He never spoke much about the war, but he kept a photograph on the wall, a grainy black and white image of a Jeep with its hood open, surrounded by soldiers staring at an engine that shouldn't have existed. The lesson endured long after the last shot was fired. The Jeep's engine was not merely a mechanical achievement, it was a demonstration of ideological strength disguised as metal and combustion. Totalitarian systems build monuments to power, vast, rigid, impressive structures that crumble when stressed. Democratic systems build tools and empower individuals to improve them. The former creates spectacle, the latter creates resilience. And in the crucible of history's most destructive conflict, resilience proved more valuable than spectacle every time. There is a quiet poetry in the image of Eugene Hartley kneeling in the frozen mud, hands black with grease, rebuilding an engine the world told him was sufficient. He didn't seek permission. He didn't wait for orders. He saw a problem, imagined a solution, and made it real through skill, determination, and an unshakable belief that limits exist only until someone refuses to accept them. That spirit, the willingness to question, to tinker, to risk failure in pursuit of improvement, defined not just one man or one engine, but an entire nation's approach to the impossible. The homemade Jeep engine made 200 horsepower, but its true power was immeasurable. It carried soldiers to safety. It challenged assumptions, and it whispered a truth that echoed across battlefields and through history. That freedom, when given to capable hands, becomes the most formidable weapon of all.